The Byzantine Empire was founded in 330 by Constantine, when he built his new capital in Constantinople. This new capital ultimately severed the Roman Empire in two, and the term Byzantine refers to the Eastern Roman Empire. Constantine did not mean to sever his empire, but strains of language and theological differences eventually brought this result. Early Byzantine art is virtually indistinguishable from early Christian art, but around the 6th century, a profound difference at last manifests itself. The Byzantine Empire ended in 1453 when Constantinople was captured by the Turks and renamed Istanbul, capital of the Ottoman Empire. Despite the end of the empire itself, its art continued, particularly through its influence in the Eastern Orthodox Church, with its traditions continuing long after the empire's collapse. As a general rule, Byzantine art will become more abstract and symbolic than the early Christian art from which it derives. Some of the churches that we'll look at under the area of Byzantine art can be classified more accurately as early Christian because of their location in the Western Roman Empire. However, we're going to look at them in the Byzantine context because of their importance in signaling the transition from early Christian to Byzantine art. In spirit, the art we'll look at belongs more closely to the Byzantine category. This is the Mausoleum of Galla Placida in Ravenna, France, dating from around 425 to 450. Now, this small mausoleum is reflective of which early church plan? The central plan structure in the form of a cross. This cruciform structure, in essence, is a combination of the two plans and will be modified and frequently employed in Christian architecture, using a basilica-type plan with a domed crossing. Now, would you stop to look twice at this building? Probably not. It seems normal, even plain. Let's look inside with the next slide. This is a view into the dome of the Mausoleum of Galla Placida. Who would have guessed that this would be inside? The interior dome will be the twist to come in the basilica plan. Again, this building is largely symbolic in its design. The outside is superficial and unimportant. The inside is where the heart of the matter is. This is the Good Shepherd from 425 to 450, a mosaic from the Mausoleum of Galla Placida. And it's symbolic of the tremendous mosaics inside. Every interior surface, except for the floor, in this mausoleum is covered with mosaics, such as this image from the entrance wall. The image is tied closely to early Christian art in the following ways. 1, the forms are modeled. 2, shadows are cast. And 3, a natural space is created. However, a major difference occurs here. Is Christ seen merely as the Good Shepherd? No. The transition to Christ the King is underway, a concept that will be amplified in later Byzantine art. This is the interior of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna, dedicated in the year 504. And further maturing of the Byzantine style can be seen in the mosaics in this particular church, built around 504. And let's look at some of those mosaics with the next. This is the Miracle of the Loaves and Fishes from the top register of the nave wall, so this would be above the clerestory windows, from Sant'Apollinare Nuovo. Now, how do these figures differ from the mosaic of Christ as the Good Shepherd that we just looked at? Well, the poses are formal and rigid. Look at the handling of the drapery. It's schematized. And then the last thing, and maybe one of the most important things here, is the downplay of the natural environment's importance. For example, where's the blue sky? This is the calling of Peter, a mosaic in the upper register of the north wall of the nave of San Apollinare Nuovo. And the calling of Peter continues this move away from naturalism. Forms now are important only for what they symbolize. While this image is still providing a narrative function for the viewer, others will provide an altogether different function, as seen in the next slide. This is the procession of Virgin Martyrs, mosaics on the north wall of the nave. Now, this procession of Virgin Martyrs, like the Virgin enthroned themes to come, does not so much tell a story as give us something to contemplate. This type of mosaic will be of great influence to later Byzantine icons. Point of interest. Different techniques were used for different purposes. The artists of one workshop understood the importance of the symbol of Virgin and Child, for instance, and stressed its overall importance as opposed to documenting the virgin birth as an occurrence that happened at a given time. Now, the sort of frontality of pose and flattening of the image that we see in this procession scene leads us away from any action reading of the scene. This is San Apollinare in Classe, Ravenna, Italy, from 533 to 549. Now, the San Apollinare in Classe is a basilica-planned church in which we can easily see how the raised nave with aisles of lesser height to either side allow for the clerestory windows, and this illuminates the tremendous mosaics that we'll find inside once again. The cylindrical tower that you see off to the left is a later addition to this church. Still, we have rather unimposing structures, at least from the exterior, in contrast to Roman and Greek temples. One other reason for this design may be further function or concept related. These churches were meant to be seen as inviting, not imposing or frightening. The unique needs of the believers shape the very form of their building. This is an apse mosaic from San Apollinare in Classe from around 549. The mosaics in San Apollinare in Classe are as magnificent as any we've yet seen, and take another step toward realizing the mature Byzantine style. We'll look next at a detail from the apse mosaic. This is called the Transfiguration. Now, in what ways is the apse mosaic here less natural? Well, one thing that's rather odd in an environmental view such as this is the fact that there's no overlapping. Look closely. You don't see anything in front of anything else. And this causes a lesser tie to the three-dimensional world, and it makes it easier to read these things as symbols. Space is sacrificed for the clarity of the image here. And in this particular image, we see the further evolution of Christ. He's simply shown through the cross. These moves away from naturalism are strictly for the sake of making sure that we get the point. Now, one symbol in the apse mosaic almost seems more like an image out of Monty Python's Flying Circus, as opposed to a serious image of grave religious consequence, that of the hand at the very top of this image. This is the betrayal of Christ from around 500 AD, and here we're going back to San Apollinare Nuovo's mosaics, and we see what to many people is a familiar image. Now, how has the face of Christ changed from earlier representations? He's bearded now. He must be wiser. What purpose does this serve? It better carries all of the baggage that's associated with Christ. For all intents and purposes, this image of Christ remains unchanged to this day. However, considering how it evolved in its own right, perhaps it's not the correct image at all, a point that's in keeping with the second commandment. This is the church of San Vital in Ravenna, 526 to 547 AD, and this is an octagonal variation on the central plan church. This central plan church will be the dominant form in Byzantine architecture, despite its seemingly being ill-suited to the needs of the building. Whether this incongruity was practical, religious, or political in nature, we do not know. Two concentric octagons make for the clerestory lighting in this church. This and a second story in the ambulatory are features that will become dominant in Byzantine structures. This is an interior view from the apse into the choir at San Vital. And this view from the apse gives you a preacher's eye view of the interior. Now on the right, you'll see the location of the following mosaic. This is the Feast of Abraham and the Three Men, mosaic on the north side of the chancel of San Vital from around 547. Now how does this image depicting the hospitality of Abraham differ from the views of Emperor Justinian and Empress Theodora in your text from this church? It's narrative again. The narrative technique was often used in conjunction with Old Testament stories told in the mosaics. Now, other figures such as Moses, Abel, and others join Abraham in mosaics covering the entire sanctuary. These narrative images stand for past deeds and sacrifices that were seen as being acceptable to God. Now here is that view of Emperor Justinian and his attendants from around 547 AD, a mosaic at San Vital. The Emperor Justinian and his Empress Theodora are then depicted in largely Byzantine non-narrative fashion in the apse. Reading these images in light of their context, one can see how Justinian and Theodora saw themselves as modern Abrahams and Moseses by their placement next to the apse vault of Christ. Justinian's halo, bejeweled crown, and regal robe signify him to be Christ's regent on earth. Now, whose image is least sympathetic here? Maximianus. You see him to the right of center. He was an archbishop that was hated by the citizenry, and he's shown as being rather grim in this image. Some orange tesserae seem to cause his lip to quiver and his eyes to twitch. This may be one of the earliest portraits where the contempt of the artist for his subject shows. This can be compared to Goya's famous example of his painting of the royal family that's seen later on in your textbook. Now, we don't want to beat a dead horse so far as the Byzantine characteristics here, but let's look at two unique facets of the mosaic. First, it's got hierarchical ordering. Differences are established through obvious portraits versus types. Look at the figures off to the far left. Their faces are all virtually the same, yet the central figures of greater importance are very unique. And secondly, there's a slight overlapping of figures. Look at the feet. Look how someone's just slightly in front of someone else, or the robe. There does appear to almost be a struggle going on between Maximianus and Justinian. Now, another thing that's important here is the lavish use of gold for the background, and this is a major characteristic of Byzantine art. Here is Empress Theodora and her attendants from 547, a mosaic at San Vital. Now, Theodora is presented much as Justinian. She, however, carries the wine, while Justinian carried the bread. The entire sanctuary may be a symbol for man's redemption by Christ through its reenactment with the sacraments. However, I don't think there's any question that the salvation of Justinian and Theodora were foremost in their minds here. They are first in line, so to speak. Tremendous detail abounds in these mosaics. They're wonderful, wonderful creations by the Byzantine artists. This is Christ between angels and saints, the Second Coming, a mosaic from the apse vault at San Vital. Now, the apse vault contains the image of Christ at the Second Coming. The figures here are more elongated than early Christian styles, and sets yet another stylistic precedence for later works. There exists no great difference in the presentation of Christ compared to Justinian, and this shows how rulers saw themselves as deities in the old traditions living on. Now, Eastern churches and later Byzantine churches took on a vastly different look, much closer in appearance to the architecture associated with Islam. This is the Hagia Sophia by Anthemius and Isidorus. This is found in Istanbul, Turkey, 532 to 537 AD. Now, the Hagia Sophia in what was then Constantinople is one such church. This is a radical departure from previous churches, even of the Byzantine period. Now, how does the Hagia Sophia strike you? It's imposing, unapproachable. It's of a vast scale. Justinian wanted a monument to the glory of the church and the glory of the state. I think Justinian must have had an enormous ego. Witness his attitude compared to early Christian attitudes toward images, in general, in which they almost made them in fear of retribution. The passage of time may have softened this concern. Nevertheless, Justinian used an unorthodox but effective method of making his pantheon of Constantinople come true. Remember, Anthemius and Isidorus were not architects by trade when you consider this building. Anthemius was an expert in geometry, and Isidorus taught physics. What better way to come up with a striking new plan than to appoint people with the knowledge necessary, but not the background, to design and supervise the building, which is a real eye-grabber. The summit of the dome that you see here is 165 feet high. Now, how was this massive dome supported? It was supported through what are called pendentives. And the slide that we see here is domes on pendentives and squinches. The pendentive is a curved triangular arch that displaces the weight from the dome into 4 square bay corners. Similarly, the squinches bridge the corner of a square on which a dome rested. This is the interior of the Hagia Sophia. Now, this pendentive approach was probably the major contribution to architectural engineering at this time, in that it made possible the marriage of a dome with an open rectangular space. This is a capital from the Hagia Sophia, and elements of the Ionic order were kept in early Christian capitals, but generally they were more decorative and resembled truncated pyramids, such as this one. It's very ornate, and perhaps that better suits it to the elaborate mosaics of the day. We're going to look now at later Byzantine art and architecture. And later Byzantine architecture is characterized by an even more elaborate exploration of the relationship of the dome to the open rectangular nave. This is an aerial view of St. Mark's in Venice. This was begun in the year 1063. Now, this aerial view of St. Mark's shows it to be an example of a derivation on the quincunx church type. That's Q-U-I-N-C-U-N-X. And that's of a cross-in square with 5 domes. Now, generally in a quincunx, the domes occur at the corners, with the crosses formed by 4 protruding barrel vaults. As we see here in the interior from St. Mark's in Venice, it was the largest and most lavishly decorated of the late Byzantine churches. No doubt it was meant to serve a very large population. We're going to look now at dome mosaics from the 11th century. This is a monastery church in Daphne, Greece. And majestic representations of Christ abound in late Byzantine art. Christ the Pantocrator, or ruler of the universe, is located at the center of the dome itself. One almost feels spun in by the surrounding mosaics to this stern, if not menacing, view of Christ. He holds a book which signifies the Word, as in the following. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Christ here embodies the Trinity. God through the Word, Christ as the Son, the risen Christ, and the Holy Ghost. Now this is Pantocrator, a mosaic in the apse of the Cathedral of Cefalù from 1148. This is a colossal image of Christ as Pantocrator. This is about 100 years later, and this shows a new hierarchical ordering with the representation of Christ. The Pantocrator looms as judge of the world. In both of these last 2 slides, there's no questioning who's the boss. Now, while not the largest or most important or grand images of Byzantine art, I find Byzantine painting to be the most remarkable contribution of the era. Combining the magnificent colors of the mosaics, as well as their designs or use of symbols, with the luscious qualities of paint, made for an irresistible combination. This is David composing the Psalms from the Paris Psalter, from around 900 AD. This page here is about 14 by 10 inches. Now, David composing the Psalms is a bit of a surprise, considering its place in late Byzantine art. It's a surprise because we have Greek symbols, and we see the influence of Pompeian wall painting techniques. Now, some artists of this time showed their affinity and enthusiasm for antique art by combining it with their Christian subjects. The most, however, continued the rich tradition of image as symbol. Icons, which are devotional symbols of saints, generally painted on wooden panels, dated largely from the 12th to the 14th centuries. And here is one of those icons. This is Madonna enthroned from the late 13th century. It's tempera paint on panel, and it's about 32 by 19.5 inches. Now, icons such as this were viewed as sermons written in the forms. In Orthodox churches today, icons are still used as a basic form of Christian education. Now, is there something funny about the perspective in this painting? The vanishing point is presented as if it's on this side of the picture, symbolizing a window into heaven which is bigger than what we see from this side. Now, the flatness of these icons also symbolize the very difference in dimension between heaven and earth.